Is the world more peaceful today? 10 years ago, in 2014, we asked if war was coming to an end. Looking at long-term trends, it seemed like violent conflict was decreasing, and the world was more peaceful than ever before. Wars between countries were becoming rare, civil wars were being resolved through diplomacy, and overall, fewer people were dying in conflicts compared to previous centuries. Our video from 2014 started with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war between Hamas and Israel. Now, a decade later, we could begin this discussion in the exact same way. But is the world actually more violent today than it was 10 years ago? In 2014, we made 7 key claims about war and peace in the world. 1. The number of deaths from conflict was lower than ever before. 2. Wars between countries were almost non-existent. 3. Democracies did not fight each other. 4. International borders were mostly stable and rarely challenged. 5. Most violent conflicts happened in places that were once under colonial rule or controlled by the Soviet Union. 6. Civil wars were increasingly being resolved through diplomacy rather than outright victory. 7. We were living in the most peaceful era in human history. A decade later, let's examine these claims again and see if they still hold up. Some of the deadliest wars from 2014 have ended or at least cooled down. The war in Afghanistan came to an end when the Taliban regained control. The civil wars in Yemen and Libya are still ongoing, but they have turned into stalemates, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. ISIS, which once controlled large parts of Iraq and Syria, has been defeated as a territorial entity. In a surprising turn, the rebels in Syria won the war just last week. South Sudan's civil war ended with a fragile peace agreement, though violence still erupts from time to time. But despite some conflicts ending, new wars have broken out, and unresolved issues from the past have reignited. In 2014, we argued that wars between countries were almost extinct. For the most part, this remained true, as civil wars continued to be the most common type of armed conflict. One of the deadliest civil wars in recent history was the Tigray War in Ethiopia, which took place from 2020 to 2022. This war resulted in over 500,000 deaths, most of them civilians. Other major civil wars have erupted in Sudan, Myanmar, and Yemen. Meanwhile, many African nations, including Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, Burkina Faso, and Mozambique, have been struggling with violent insurgencies that have killed tens of thousands of people. While civil wars continue to be the dominant form of conflict, wars between countries are happening again. In 2020, a short but intense war between Azerbaijan and Armenia resulted in territorial changes. The latest war between Israel and Hamas has escalated into a regional crisis, affecting neighboring countries. But perhaps the most alarming development is Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This marks the first time in decades that a major power has attempted to conquer and subjugate another country by force. The war in Ukraine began in 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea and the conflict in the Donbas region. However, in 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion, leading to a prolonged and devastating war. Estimates suggest that the war has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, with both military personnel and civilians suffering immense losses. When we look at the numbers, the situation becomes clearer. Between 2004 and 2014, around 350,000 people died in state-based conflicts. Between 2014 and 2019, the number of deaths from war was actually decreasing. However, from 2021 onwards, war deaths have surged dramatically. From 2014 to 2024, approximately 1.2 million people have died in state-based conflicts. If we include all violent conflicts, such as the Mexican drug war, the total death toll rises to 1.5 million. This means that war-related deaths in the past decade have been 3 times higher than in the previous one. The year 2022 saw the highest number of war deaths since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The wars in Tigray and Ukraine alone accounted for most of these losses, with massive battles and large-scale military offensives taking place. Although the last 3 years have been particularly violent, history tells us that things can be far worse. World War I and World War II resulted in tens of millions of deaths. Compared to those catastrophic wars, the present era is still relatively peaceful. However, the key question is whether the last few years were just an exception or the beginning of a dangerous new trend. The next decade will determine whether we continue on a path of increasing violence or return to relative peace. Some of our predictions from 2014 were proven wrong. We believed wars between countries were over, but the last decade has shown otherwise. However, other claims remain true. Most conflicts today still take place in regions that were once controlled by colonial empires or the Soviet Union. These regions suffer from artificial borders, economic inequality, and political instability, all of which contribute to ongoing conflicts. Another prediction that remains valid is that democracies do not fight each other. While democracies do engage in military operations, they do not go to war against one another. Compared to past centuries, wars between nation-states are still the exception rather than the rule. One concerning trend is that fewer civil wars are ending through diplomacy. In the past, many conflicts were resolved through negotiations and peace agreements. Today, however, more wars are ending through outright military victories or long-term stalemates. These outcomes often do not address the root causes of conflict, meaning that violence could erupt again in the future. Borders around the world have remained mostly stable, but some territorial disputes are becoming more heated. India and China have clashed over disputed territories. China continues to assert its claim over Taiwan, and Venezuela has threatened to annex part of Guyana. One major factor that makes modern wars so deadly is the involvement of external powers. Many conflicts are fueled by foreign governments that provide weapons, funding, and support to different sides. In the Middle East, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran has played a major role in various conflicts, with Iran supporting groups like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. In Ukraine, Western countries are supporting Ukraine, while China, Iran, and North Korea are backing Russia. But it's not just governments that contribute to ongoing violence. Terrorist organizations, criminal networks, and even corrupt political leaders often benefit from keeping wars going. These actors profit from war economies, making peace more difficult to achieve. There is a lot of debate among experts about what makes the world more or less peaceful. After the Cold War, many hoped that the world would follow a rules-based international order. For a while, this idea seemed to work. However, in recent years, the global balance of power has been shifting. The world is becoming multipolar, with new alliances forming and old ones breaking down. China's economy has grown to rival that of the United States and Europe combined. While the US still officially spends more on its military than any other country, China's true military budget may be much larger than reported. Meanwhile, Russia has shattered the post-World War II taboo against wars of conquest, prompting European nations to rearm themselves. We are entering a period of uncertainty where different nations and alliances are competing for power and influence. This is leading to increasing tensions, though most of these have not yet turned into full-scale wars. However, history has shown that such rivalries can escalate into global conflicts. The big question remains, is war coming to an end, or are we at the beginning of something worse? Right now, the outlook is not promising. But despite the current turmoil, we are still living in one of the least violent periods in human history. The world stands at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the coming years will shape the future.